Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. I would like to welcome you to our latest in our webinar series. Today's session is entitled Improve OT Security Efficiency and Effectiveness with a Multifunction Platform. My name is Rick Kahn. I'm the VP of Solutions, and I hope in the next hour to share some concepts with you as to what we're seeing for security trends, what we've seen many organizations do in the past, that some of which works and some doesn't, and give you some case studies of organizations who are embracing an OT systems-based approach, meaning going to the endpoint in a multifunction platform significantly changes the day and the capability of your program. So to get there, I'd like to go through some introductions. A little bit about where do we start. We got to look at a little bit of the platform, the environment and the options that we have available to us, what some organizations have started, what some of those challenges are. And we're also going to lean heavily on North American power industry, which has sort of run down the regulatory / maintenance path and learned some lessons the hard way. Not saying that we need to secure the same way power does or that compliance is security, but there are some pretty valuable lessons in how you establish and maintain a security program that we can glean from that particular industry and their experiences. As I mentioned, we have a couple of case studies. I want to throw a few organizational considerations out there. A lot of people talk about how do we converge IT and OT? We did solicit some questions ahead of time prior to this event, and I will try to get to those either throughout today's session with our content or directly at the end. But we often get asked, how do we manage this? In getting to a summary, hopefully, that sums back to what we promised, and then, of course, open for questions. So first, I'd like to introduce myself and the company. For those of you who are not familiar with us, our company name is Verve Industrial Protection. We were founded actually 25 years ago as a systems integrator. So everything that we do and talk about today in OT is something that we've learned by being boots on the ground, doing PLC programming, DCS upgrades, et cetera. And we still have a healthy business division, if you see here in our three different buckets of offerings, automation engineering. And everything I'm talking about for security has been a large part of that for almost half of that. So about 13 years now, we've been deploying our particular solution into OT space, and that is a large part of where we draw our conclusions from. Verve itself also has, of course, a Verve Security Center platform. If you haven't heard about it, it is a multifunction platform. I'm not going to be talking so much about the specifics and the nuances of our platform as much as the philosophy that goes behind it and why that is so valuable. And if you've done any reading lately on the Gartner website, they are highly recommending more and more organizations, both IT and OT, ditch the siloed individual tool approach and look for more of a multifunction platform. We'll talk about why. And when you see the gains, especially in OT, it's staggering. So as a company, we have 25 years experience in OT. We have about 13 in security. We do have software and services for cyber. We also do what we call real-time systems. Historians, plant historian, process improvement, plant architecture, network segmentation, et cetera, and of course the OT background. Myself, Rick, I'm the VP of Solutions here. What that means is I get to help clients regardless of which stage in their journey they're at. I've been doing ICS consulting for almost 20 years now. I started the ICS division at Matricon. We then got bought by Honeywell, and that's afforded me the pleasure of having seen multiple standards in multiple industries around the world, and see everything from tiny little mom and pop to large super majors, and seeing their common struggles among everyone. And hopefully we share some of those insights and shorten your learning cycle by sharing what we've seen other places. So getting started, let's set the stage, right? Traditional OT security programs, what we see are they're usually a collection of individual tools. They're not tied together, and a very low adoption and maintenance. I walked into a plant manager's office one day at the start of an assessment, and he looked at me and said, "You're going to tell me I don't patch and that I don't change passwords. How in the hell does that help me with anything?" And it's a great question. And it's largely due to the nature of OT, which prevents homogeneity and consistency. The correlation would be in IT. In IT, we're able to make everything Windows 10 and do Patch Tuesday on Tuesdays, and do upgrades to Outlook and move everything to Office 365 and do things in large swaths of automated actions. We can't do that in OT, and we actually instead in OT get what I call the mouse and the cookie. The mouse and the cookie is, if you're not familiar with it, a children's story that says if you give a mouse a cookie, it'll say, "This is lovely. Can I have a glass of milk now, please?" And then once it has the milk, it says, "Well, maybe there's some crumbs or milk on my face. Can I look in a mirror?" And then he sees his hair's out of place and wants to borrow a comb, and just sort of unravels this. You start somewhere, and next thing you know, you're 4, 5, 6, 7 things in. And I've got an illustration that shows that in OT, and it's especially prevalent in OT because as we get to, okay, I've got an asset and now I've got some risk, but I can't necessarily apply the patch. How do I make some sort of decision? And you end up down that same trail of, I need to not just know the asset or just the patch or the vulnerability. I need to know what the asset is and where it is and what other protections I may have for it, because I can't always do that sweeping, uniform lockdown and security management like we do at IT. And this, unfortunately, is all that was really available for OT when OT security began to emerge. We can, of course, use WSUS, and we can use, a separate database for antivirus. And if you have multiple OEMs, you're gonna have multiple antivirus. And it's just the way that it is. We call this the first generation security. Pockets of tools that you're supposed to, as the owner operator, kludge together and find some way to manage and drive value out of it. In fact, we have one client that we were speaking to that had 55 different security tools, 7 of which were patching tools. 7 different patching tools. So if I were to ask that organization, how's your patching? The answer is, well, it depends, which system or set of systems, and et cetera, et cetera. So the opportunity, though, is to move to what we're calling a second generation security program. And again, I mentioned earlier that Gartner recommends a multifunction platform, and that includes OT. And so today we're going to walk you through what one of those might look like in OT. It's different from IT. It's got some different technologies and different approaches, but it gets the same endpoint in that multiple functions in a single platform drives significant insight and a much more manageable security program. So longevity and scalability. What is the challenge? What are we trying to achieve here? If the picture on the left is what we're doing today, what are we trying to drive towards, right? So the challenge is to maintain, challenge for many people to maintain our current approach is very significant, right? Let's just dig in a little bit. Tasks such as patch review, configuration management, logging, et cetera, they continue to grow in need. They continue to grow in importance, but they don't necessarily get any easier. And without any sort of automation, or designated people to watch this full time, they continue to fall behind. It's this growing gap over time. As security continues unabated and our ability to keep up is slowed, the gap between us and how much risk we have continues to grow. A number of IP-enabled assets continues to grow. We had a client told us they knew their inventory. We did a walk down, they were wrong by 590%. Almost a 6-fold increase of electronics on the part floor since they last done it, right? And of course, regulatory and reporting standards continue to grow. And that's not going to change. Whether that's, again, reporting could just be corporate. I see more and more organizations saying, I don't have to adhere to a standard. You haven't even had an audit, but the board wants to know, are we secure and what do we know? And many organizations do have disparate solutions in different areas, right? Different vendors, as I mentioned earlier, mean different tools. You might have more than one antivirus tool, more than one backup tool, more than one whitelisting tool. And those are dictated by the vendor, and we can't really change those. In some cases we can work with them and say, this other tool works better. But in all cases, you, the owner operator, own all the systems and therefore need a consistent way to view and manage all of those systems. Segmentation, not usually consistent across multiple sites. And vulnerability scan-based vulnerability on the IT side is a good idea. It's death on the OT side. We can't scan all systems. We can't scan them with full vigor. And we have gaps in between when we do them. And we have gaps in the assets we're actually scanning. We're not scanning PLCs and relays, for example. And so OT security maintenance often becomes just best effort. And the other challenge with the organization views that you have often different reporting and management for different sites. I mean, we could put all the logs into your corporate SOC and the Splunk or the QRadar or what have you that you've invested in, but does that team know what they're looking at when they see OT logs, right? We have a different beast, a different need, and we have different departments, which is sometimes required, but how do we bridge them so that we're not duplicating efforts and missing lots of opportunities? So results, as I mentioned, are what we call patchwork or first generation approach. They're complex. They don't have centralized visibility, either centralized for multiple sites or centralized across multiple functions. It means that there's a lot of insecurity. It adds a lot of cost and effort and overhead and will likely lead to mistakes. An example in North America was a large power company, and you can Google their name. They had a security program that was supposed to be part of their NERC-CIP compliance. And there were so many holes and inconsistencies in the various approaches at different sites that they had a laundry list of violations, and they negotiated a very significant fine. I believe it was in the order of $10 million, just a sort of blanket approach and say, okay, we're not doing any of this right. Let's just agree to a fine. Let's go back to the drawing board and start again. Now, very large company, very large list of challenges, but there's commonality in that approach or that byproduct for many of them. So how do we get started? I want to revisit some key learnings that we've made along the way in our 20 years doing this. If we don't start with the end in mind, or I like to say, what does done look like? If we don't know what we're driving towards, we won't know when we've got there. So if I were to say to you, let's get an inventory, everybody would have their own concept of what an inventory is. But as you see here, these are the five NERC or NIST CSF categories, the respond and recover lumped into one. And over time, you traditionally build to this sort of multifunction view. And if you're not looking for, when you're talking about inventory, towards how you're going to configure and harden those systems, or how you need to segment them based on not just the asset's IP, but its function and the data it either gathers or presents, you're going to be going back to that inventory again and again and again and revisiting it. You know, a cursory listen on the wire for some IP addresses, or an old or aging manual inventory, or pulling bits of inventory from different maintenance and network management inventories, and sort of trying to remove duplicates. You're going to have holes in your understanding. And if you have holes in understanding, you're not going to have the data you need to make future more advanced decisions. So start with, what does done look like? You know that you're going to need to do multiple functions across multiple areas, and you should probably grow into them over time rather than trying to do them all at once. And you, on your wish list, what sort of things do you want to maybe put in next time? Automation. Automation of inventory is a huge deal. It's why so many people jump at network anomaly detection tools, which are designed for perimeter detection and behavior on the network, and they're fantastic at it. A byproduct is that because they're listening to everybody talking to everybody, they say they have an inventory. The challenge is it's not necessarily complete, but the automated sort of really light touch inventory is appealing in OT, where we're talking about, you know, fragile systems in a complex environment. The challenge is, once you get further down the path, that what they provide for an inventory is lacking. And so you're going to be back at that inventory stage. Did we want to aggregate the data? If you look at a decision tree, I think ISA 99 has a subgroup that put out a patching recommendation for OT. And it's got a really cool flow chart. And the flow chart has all these different arrows saying, well, do we know what the risk is? Next, do we know what it applies to? And then third, does it affect ICS? And if it does, do we have to apply the patch? And if not, what else can we do? And then the questions are, well, what is the antivirus status? What is the status of the asset? Do we have a recent backup, right? And so that aggregation of information, the multifunction platform, starts to really drive a lot of value. In a single pane of glass, much more valuable. I don't want to have to navigate between different systems to make sure I'm looking at this particular IP address relative to antivirus, and then go over here and look at it relative to backups. And management. Everybody wants to first get their heads around what they have and how it's configured or what the risk is. But the very next step is, what are you going to do about it, right? So when I'm looking at what does done look like, I want to know that I'm looking towards the future for a larger, more robust program. I want to know that I want to automate as much of what I'm doing as possible, so I don't have to go back to the well. I probably want to try and pull it into a single view for easy cross-reference and navigation between systems. And I also want to be able to do something about it. I don't want to just be informed, hey, you're on fire, I'd like you to hand me the fire extinguisher as well. Or even better, going forward, do some fire prevention, minimize your attack vector, et cetera. So start with the end in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit about a case study of an organization that did exactly that. They started as sort of disparate multi-tools that nobody was really looking at, and various patchwork coverage. In fact, they were the one that I mentioned earlier with the 500% wrong inventory. They're a multifunction environment. They have different divisions: transmission, generation, renewables, et cetera. They had 6 different major DCS vendors in total across their multiple sites. They actually had closer to 30 different labels that they needed to worry about. But they had 6 major ones that required specific types of either backup or antivirus. Multiple segments within each facility, multiple backup and AV platforms, again, because of different OEM requirements. And they had been doing scan-based vulnerability assessment, but they were doing them once every 12 months and only on redundant systems or during outage. So there were huge gaps in their ability to map what was actually out there against what was known as a risk or a threat in the wild. And the inventory was built at the beginning of their initial project. And that was a response to NERC-CIP. So they built a program many years ago. And then when we came in a couple like 3 or 4 years after the start of that, this is sort of what they had. That was their profile. Now, what they did was they reset their approach. I'm not going to go through the whole diagram here, but know that they had an actual timeline and they had different functions that they expected, whether it was design team or pre-design and rollout of hardware, of policies and procedures, of technology, et cetera. You know, they had a multi-phased on-site, off-site management support, consulting support, et cetera. But the point was that they built a multidiscipline roadmap. So they looked at the entirety of the NIST CSF. Actually, in this client, it was the CSC 20. And they looked at the multidiscipline roadmap and they decided they wanted a maturity level of 2. So that was the standard across the different sections that they were trying to achieve. So that when the CISO was working with each individual site, they knew what the goal line was. And then what they wanted to do was first examine the objective and then determine tool set of viability, because they did have some investments, some of which they kept, and some of which they wanted to redo or redesign, redeploy. Now, they retired a lot of systems that were less effective, and that therefore helped fund the project. But the objective was to get to an automated maturity. And the maturity, again, was level 2. Now, not all were achievable. And the CISO was there as that central sort of team, that small central specialized team. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about structure. But that team was able to provide both the guidance and the consistency between the different environments. But they ended up with a very prescriptive target for completion, both in what they were doing, in what order they were going to do it, and when they wanted to do it by. They planned to roll out an overall scope of sites during asset, based on asset criticality, asset vintage. They looped in known upgrades to equipment for lifecycle planning, as well as outages. And they effectively moved from being reactive, i.e. here's the standard, you shall do this, and the next audit's coming in 3 months, get ready for it, to being proactive. There wasn't a debate about should we or shouldn't we. We're just, every IP address in our scope is going to have this, and we're going to do maturity 2, and we're going to do it across the entirety of the program. And so what that looks like for them is that they built an automatically updated inventory that then pulls in asset context, right? And what this means is when you look at the mouse and the cookie again, it's not enough just to have a list of IP addresses. They built a central reporting capability that pulled in hardware inventory, software, the vulnerabilities known on those systems at the time, and it updates as well. What patches were available, sub-filtered to what the OEM approved or not, because just because I have patches outstanding doesn't mean I can or will apply them. But then going beyond that, if I can't or won't apply the patch, can I harden the system? Can I disable known exploit paths like the guest account or network shares that we don't need, et cetera? And then into enumerating the users. Again, Bluekeep, if we could disable the guest account, or, we have a client that did an audit, they found 47 dormant administrator accounts that belong to people that no longer work there. So their user and their departure policy wasn't being followed, right? And so they built this same sort of the mouse and the cookie sort of pull on the thread and go to the next level, next level, next level, and pull all their information, including the asset's criticality. Not all assets are created equal. Being able to filter the ones that are more important to the top and or treat them in emerging situations accordingly lets us be much more of, I like to call it a cyber sniper, as opposed to just, blanket shotgunning out trying to get something done. So they built the asset inventory with the context, which included these other components in it, and the ability, again, to take actions. Remember the manage part of vulnerability management or asset management. And then they turned on certain alerts, and all of it came into a central dashboard. This is how they decided and were able to manage the viewability and the tracking of all of the standards at multiple sites. Remember, there were 6 sites, hundreds, almost, I think, a few thousand assets total in scope. So the end result is that inventory is the underpinning. You need to get it right. And then you can pivot into different functions that cumulatively make a robust security program. Again, talking about a multifunction platform. The single platform overcomes the challenge of multiple disparate tools. Automated data collection gives accurate data. This particular case study, the client in this case is able to see within 15 minutes if there's a new asset on any one of their subnets. Multi-perspective asset view creates better security and insight. Again, if I can't apply the patch, but I know that the system is hardened, and it's in layer 2 of the Purdue model, and the attack vector is network-based and it's very complex, I'm not as concerned as if I just simply put a list of thousands of risks up in front of your face on a vulnerability scan. The ability to act speeds identification and remediation. I've got a very specific case study on that, so I'm not gonna go too far into that one. I want to save that for the big reveal, the second case study. And the aggregation of data types, topics, et cetera, greatly increase speed and accuracy of regulatory reporting. Not just regulatory, but management reporting, tracking, or simply triage. And again, the case study is going to show a side-by-side comparison with and without a centralized automated platform relative to managing something like Bluekeep. So next slide. Pause for water. Excuse me for a moment. The new approach, which leverages the multi-discipline platform I was just describing there. How do we do it though? If we approach security as a multi-dimensional, multi-discipline program, as opposed to what IT does today and says, I want an expert in just networking. They know everything about networking, not necessarily about the applications running on it or how it works. That's nice to have. It lets you get a specialist and leverage them across multiple things, but it also creates silos. And when in OT, you can't just make an arbitrary decision. You need to make a multi-input collaborative decision. Those silos work against you. You can proactively work with your vendors that either fit into current operational organizations, like your owner-operator requirements, or to help them to remove barriers. One of the things we often get with organizations is they say, well, I can't patch, the vendor has to patch, it costs a lot of money to patch. And we had one where the vendor came in and patched at one of those sites, and it cost a lot of money. And when they were done, their risks on that system went from 1,200 to 800. They still had 800. You, the owner operator, still own 800. Now, in that case, the owner operator decided that they wanted to continue to patch beyond what the vendor approved. And I don't blame the vendor. The vendor tracks and researches the risks that they're able to understand and that affect their software, but you still own that operating system, that particular asset running Windows, and you own all the rest of the risk. In this particular case, they worked with the client, said, we're just going to, or rather the vendor, and they said, we're going to take your approved list and do them and let it bake in, but then we're going to go and do the other ones. And can we still get support? And they said, well, I guess so, sure, but just know that you might have some issues. The operator said, I'd rather have the patches than not. And so they went and proceeded to patch the systems fully. Not always available. Sometimes the vendor really pushes back. Sometimes it doesn't work in your OT environment for what's happening. But these are the sorts of conversations we need to have. And I'm saying here, many OEMs are loosening restrictions. We're currently talking to multiple security or OEM vendors who have fully, I don't want to say abandoned, but fully pivoted to the idea that they're going to let security companies build security tools, and they are simply going to white label them because their job and their expertise is in building control equipment and maintenance and uptime, et cetera. And so by white labeling someone like a Verve or any of the others that are available on the market, that security vendor does all of their R&D on being the best security tool possible, and the OEM simply incorporates it. We're seeing more and more OEMs reaching out for that sort of approach. We want to streamline the tools. I've already talked about that a lot, how if I pull multiple data points together and I can look at it in a single screen, I'm not navigating between different logins and data sources, which lets me aggregate those data sources to better focus on risk. And again, I've got an example, which I'll share for you in a minute. We want to incorporate management, and I bold this, I italicize it, and I add the stars, because it's not enough to simply know you have a risk. It's not enough to simply know you have an inventory. You need to move to risk reduction. Vulnerability management is not just vulnerability assessment. And so, you know, I was talking with a client the other day, wanted inventory and a vulnerability scan. They're stopping there. And I'm like, great. So somebody can come in and tell you what's at risk. How are you going to fix it? And when something happens to any of those, if something happens, you now are in a worse position because you knew you had that risk and something has now happened. You didn't actually get into it and fix anything, right? So if you have a multidiscipline tool like this and a multifunction with the different data sources, I can take all of my risks and I can filter that to just critical risk on, for example, what operations deems are high impact assets. So now I'm going to critical on high impact. And then if I pull in the backup status or the whitelisting status to see if I've got other protections, I could, if something pops out of that, i.e. it doesn't have a recent backup, it's a high impact asset according to operations and a critical risk, I'm now going right to the very heart of my risk. Out of hundreds or thousands of noise, I can go to the 20 or 30 that might bring me to my knees. And I go from just being aware to being aware with context and focus, and now being able to actually manage it. The Spanish Armada learned this the hard way. I was watching the History Channel the other day, and the Spanish Armada, big, large, lots of resources, many cannons, many ships, big, powerful, etc. The English managed to defeat them. And a large part of it was the Armada. They built all their tools individually, different cannons of different sizes with different cannonballs. And so as they're at the heat of the battle, they're trying to find the right cannonball for the right cannon. They can't find it. They're fumbling around, and as the ships rock around in the water, what you thought was there for a pile rolls away. Now you got to go find them. The English, on the other hand, standardized. Everybody on all the ships knew exactly what they had and where to go, and they could all use the same cannons. And the much smaller, underpowered Navy managed to defeat the big, powerful guys because they had, at the top view, an organization that said, let's be consistent, let's be standard, let's know what we're doing and how and where we're doing it. And the result was significant. So that's a pivot into the organizational. So what should it look like as an organization? It's great to have a multifunction tool. I always get asked, who's going to look at it? Great question. And I've got a couple slides on that coming up. We call it Think Global, Act Local. So first we need to do is build alignment at the top. We need to do risk assessment and risk acceptance. This doesn't mean simply OT doing their own thing and telling IT, we'll do it, we got it, and building a duplicate environment. This doesn't mean IT coming in and saying, okay, we've got tools, don't worry about it. Your dashboard looks like my dashboard, let's just use mine. There needs to be risk assessment, risk acceptance, and aligning on objective and metrics. Again, we talked about what does done look like. Building your portfolio of initiatives. We don't have to boil the ocean and be done in a day or start at the top and do everything everywhere. But we also want senior level responsibilities. This may be oversight, this may be funding, this may be helping to decide. Again, the one client I showed you, the CISO's office designated one particular person for the balance of the project, and all 6 locations, as they went through their navigation of how to achieve maturity level 2, was able to get that same consistent messaging and backup. They all knew what they were driving towards. Follow the money, right? Look at your total spend on cyber expenses. If you look at the inefficiencies of what you're doing today, yes, WSUS, for example, or SCCM looks very affordable, but when you look at the effort across multiple sites and the lack of visibility, you might change your mind as to whether that's worth it. Determine the budget commitment to cybersecurity's percentage of revenue is usually a good standard. We always get people that are surprised by, well, by the time you do all the stuff you need on OT, it's expensive. But then again, look how much you're spending on IT. I live in Calgary, Alberta, sort of what I call the Texas of Canada, Western Canadian oil hub. And I was talking to an organization 3 weeks ago. They have 150 people in IT, and they've just recently brought on one guy for OT security. And when you look at the fact that there's actually as many or more IP addresses and assets running on the OT side, why isn't it 1-to-1? I don't think we need 150 on both sides, and we're never going to get 150, but we need to be able to make sure that we articulate the value and the spend that's required. Now, think global, act local. We sort of alluded to this with the CISO. The functional capability, and again, the case study I'm going to show you shows the value of that think global, act local. And it allows for the OT side to have a very small specialized team of experts oversee all the emerging risk in the assets. But the act local means the OT team, boots on the ground, get that last oversight. Nobody touches the systems until OT says it's okay or OT's involved. Scorecards and KPIs. Again, I love doing assessments. I used to do them. I used to sell them all the time. But as soon as I hand you that paper, it starts to age. If I could say, here you go, let's look at this dashboard together. And then as we make improvements, we see the reds become yellow and eventually green. Or when something like Bluekeep comes out, we see exactly where it hits us. We're building for the future. We're not simply doing a point in time assessment and building a roadmap that I need that's valuable today, May of 2021, but starts to change as soon as I make changes. We need that sort of automated feedback. And then finally, get tactical. Detailed operational action plans, link actions to specific outcomes, and develop detailed accountabilities. Speaking of accountabilities, what does your team look like? To be able to achieve a multifunction program, and you probably have a lot of these in your organization anyway. Now, this I think is about a year old, but these are the percentage of jobs currently available on cyberseek.com. You always hear about them, 100, million or 2 million or however many million unfulfilled security jobs are out there. We'll now make it OT security, which is a bit more of a niche, and we've really got a lack of capability. Now, The reason I articulated orange versus maybe white is I wanted to show what the biggest need is. And this is 60%, 70 some percent of the jobs out there are around management, operate and maintain, actively protect through vulnerability analysis, responding to threats, keeping whitelisting and AV up to date, secure provision as we bring in new programs. The reason I started the department of Matricon was actively putting in alarm management loop tuning projects. If we undid the security, we weren't helping the client, right? And so you can see, as you build your team, you're probably going to need a very operational perspective to understand planning and outages, but also support and vendor outreach, the very OT portion of these sorts of decisions and actions. But then on the skill set side, you're going to need networking, security, compliance, patching, all the different security tools that you might need. Now, it doesn't mean that I need one of each of every of these. I want to leverage the expertise that's in the organization from the IT side. And so that's why we recommend to think global, act local. If you do what we recommend and we automate the inventory and its context, so here's the IP and MAC address, then I'm bringing it in and I'm adding the antivirus status. I'm bringing the operator's knowledge to see if the asset is a critical risk. If it goes offline, is it a critical risk to operations? Is it a redundant system in the DMZ perhaps? And everything in between. I'm pulling in the whitelisting and backup status so that when I get to that small set of experts, I can call on the network expert or the risk expert. And this smaller team is able to do analysis for the entire operational fleet. So we can research and design once and then take actions multiple times. With the architecture we recommend, you can even automate a lot of those actions. And again, a lot of that is in the case study, which starts in the very next slide. So I'll save it for there. But this sort of architecture allows you to leverage very scarce resources and streamline your process. If you were to be able to have a small team look at Bluekeep for the entirety of the organization and be able to empirically see in a dashboard what it's doing to you and how you are achieving security against it, you've completely changed the game. And this type of architecture means I can do all the planning and as much automation as possible, but I don't actually touch the endpoints. Let's see what that looks like. So second case study of today's session, working with a large operating company and thousands of miles of assets, right? Transmission, pipeline, rail, all the longer distance, often have assets in unmanned or geographically remote or bandwidth challenged environments. They have a distributed team of SCADA operational and security and compliance members throughout North America, thousands of assets comprised of varying OS types, thousands of networking and switchgear, and thousands of PLCs and relays. Now, this is a very large organization. Yes, if you're a smaller one, then the numbers don't scale, but the same premise holds true. The same order of magnitude improvement will be legitimate in both cases. All the assets are spread across lots of physical sites, of which many are unmanned. Now, when they had two incidents, one before and one after the deployment of this type of architecture and this think global, unified platform approach. Before they had dozens of people, Bluekeep came out, dozens of people or something like Bluekeep. Bunch of people were called to a meeting room. They bought whatever little snippets of inventory they thought they might have. They had multiple meetings over the next number of weeks. They didn't really have a concrete understanding of scope. We know we have Bluekeep. We know we need to line it up, but we're not sure which assets and who owns them and how we're going to do this. In fact, many guesses and assumptions were made. They found some IP addresses that they didn't know the name of or the naming convention. And so they literally remote desktoped into it. And yeah, they guessed the admin password and credentials. And they looked at the system, the start run programs to see what software was running on it. And then they went backwards from that saying, oh, I know somebody who's on the Maximo team. Maybe they know what this asset is. And then the manual patching process begins. They had a file and they put it on different file shares. They'd remote desktop to the target system. They'd go to pull it down. Maybe they'd use WSUS or SCCM, depending on which asset, its criticality, its bandwidth, et cetera. And the manual tracking also began. And the total effort, roughly, 6 full-time staff diverted from operational tasks for 10 full weeks. So they lost 60 weeks of work and they spent about 2,500 hours. They reached 90% coverage. Some of the systems just couldn't take it, couldn't take the specific patches. And they didn't have any time to do any compensating controls or what have you. They just applied the patch where they could, and if they couldn't, they moved on. Significant reduction in risk, but also significant diversion of staff. Now, once they had this sort of multifunction automated approach, they tried it again with a different incident. Unfortunately, another patch came because that's just what happens. In this case, the central team had what we call 360-degree view of the assets, right? So they knew all assets in scope by type of asset, i.e. They could split it up by engineering station versus domain controller or historian, or by OS, vintage OS, et cetera. Its location, the criticality of that system, whether it was a redundant system or a primary system, and the owner and the function. They had all of that at their fingertips. A completely different starting point. And they had all of the known patch applicability mapped to those assets, right? So if it needed the patch, it was in their dashboard. And the kickoff meeting was very different. They only had a small set. They didn't need the 15 or 20 people that were brought to the initial meeting. And the first task at that meeting was to disable remote desktop on all assets. That same think global, act local in the automated action. Remember we talked about management. Let them disable remote desktop temporarily on all their assets, thereby preventing this risk while they ran around and did some patching. The second task, of course, they notified the field staff to say, hey, by the way, this is what's happening for the next 48 to 72 hours. And if you need access, let us know. We can turn these on or off one at a time, right? So they had an immediate risk reduction. They then also started to pre-deploy the files in an automated, very slow, low bandwidth trickle to the endpoint. So while they're busy planning, the files are being delivered to the endpoints ready to go. Nobody's touching it yet, but they're all ready to go so that when it was time to deploy, they could deploy in exactly the order they wanted. They could test, for example, on newer versions of server and a redundant domain controller in the data center before they did an engineering station in a remote unmanned facility, for example. Now, when they could, they left the remote desktop turned off or they disabled the guest account. They also did compensating controls. Remember the mouse and the cookie, you can't always do your first pass, which is apply the patch, so I better know what other things I can do. And the report, because it was live, the reporting dashboard updated as they made their progress. In total, they only had 3 staff instead of 6. They only had 600 hours instead of 2,600. And they were able to not only patch the same 90%, they were able to lock down and provide compensating controls on the remaining 10. Very, very significant difference in your effort. And this alone, the hours alone of 3 staff over multiple weeks, almost covered the entirety of the cost for that project, the installation project, and most of the licensing for the first year. Talk about ROI. I mean, it's right there. Plus, they didn't divert staff from the operational tasks that they were trying to do. They have, of course, upgrades and control system projects to do throughout the year as well. So what are the benefits? And I sort of just alluded to it. Cost is greatly reduced. Automation saves time and increases accuracy. And the central view leverages scarce resources. We don't want to try and go find an army. As much as there's 150 IT to 1 OT, we're not going to have 150 to 150. But if I can get it down to 3 to 5 or 2 or 3 that are the reps, and then they pull on the experts, we're leveraging our company's resources in a very, very efficient manner. OT safety is also ensured this way, right? We had a client wanted to remove software. And so we found 146 copies of it. We sent a command that says uninstall it. And they set a flag, said don't do anything until someone's physically standing at the console. And in that case, OT gets to walk down to the individual system and decide whether or not to do the action and to oversee any sort of reboot if it's required on their pace. And as soon as it's done, it's reported in the dashboard. So you get that OT oversight. You're not Big Brother trying to do something and hoping nothing bad happens. And then most importantly, we get context. We understand OT. Again, a critical risk on what is a high impact to operations asset that doesn't have a recent good backup and maybe whitelisting is not locked down. That's where I want to start. If I could give you that information, you'd be what I call a cyber sniper. You'd be able to go right to the risk. And the tracking, reporting, and visibility are significantly improved, and they're completely lacking in almost all cases in OT today. So that same client, as they built their standard across CSC 20, you can see along the bottom, they have multiple measures of the actual standard and their level of compliance relative to the maturity standard they achieved. So they've gone from, this is the client that had the 500% wrong inventory because they did it manually 5 years ago, to now having a real-time live dashboard that helps them to better understand what they have, where they're going, and what the finish line looks like. And this is what Gartner's talking about, where you drive the efficiencies in that multifunction platform. And so what are the options? How do we get there? In other words, right? If we decided, yeah, that sounds really cool and I want to get there, but I have no idea where to start. There's multiple options and we can help you with that. It comes down to a combination of best practice security, empirical risk that we've identified from the data and the environment, but also your organization's risk appetite, right? Full team awareness and involvement, right? We will get rapid improvement. The question is, are we ready for it? And who needs to see it and support it? We can do a methodical rollout by business unit, by risk. So we have a manufacturing client today that they know from an operational, revenue, a regulatory, number of different perspectives what they think is the highest priority facility. They've got 3 buckets: gold, silver, and bronze, and they're doing all the gold ones first, full deployment top to bottom. And then 8 quarters into the project, they'll have all the bronze ones done, and they'll be looking at a consistent view across all of them. We have another client that is doing it the opposite way. Their biggest risk is the patching and the configuration of Windows devices. They've ignored all the other network gear, switch gear, the embedded relays, PLCs, controllers, how they're configured, what risks are there. They're going to get to those. But they wanted to do all of their OS-based devices around the world in 57 countries. And they've got that first level, that 80% what they think of are the total risk in the environment. And they're looking at any one of those assets in 57 countries through that dashboard. And now they have such better insight that they're now able to very carefully plan what the next steps are, i.e. maybe we'll do the controllers next. And within individual industries, you could also pick by function. So for power, do we want to start with generation? Much more contained. We're not running all over the countryside. We're not challenged with bandwidth issues. Maybe a little bit easier. It's also a higher number of assets. There's multiple ways, and any good consultant can help you decide it, but it has to go back to the practicality of both your organization, how it operates, but also what their risk appetite is. And then I mentioned already the staged approach. So you can start with everyone gets base inventory and visibility, and then everyone gets to grow into patching and hardening, and eventually into alerting and monitoring and host-based intrusion detection, et cetera. Multiple ways to do it. Again, we've seen it done multiple ways. There's pros and cons to everything. The solution has to fit your organization. So what are the benefits of the second generation? Just to sort of tie it back to the bullets that I hope we hit and promise to share with you by coming and spending an hour of your time with us today. There's 2 benefits, both at the project level as we deploy this. And I do want to dig into it because too many people do security as a project and don't realize they're needing to change a culture. And then the second is on the maintenance. Once you've deployed it, what are we gaining by this approach over traditional security tools and projects? On the project level, by having a multi-division, multi-department involvement, you're going to get much better planning and much better execution. We continue to run into organizations where either the IT or the OT department plans and tries to execute on their own without incorporating their colleagues. And we invariably waste weeks and months, as everybody argues, and we have to start from scratch with the department that wasn't involved in the planning to begin with. Also, just because you and I can go and do a project at one of your sites and high-five each other, yay, good job. If we don't incorporate the people at the plant that are responsible for the tools during the project, they're not going to either know what it's for, not really embrace it. They don't have any investment in it. It wasn't part of their project. We're not going to get great maintenance. So that gives me the third point there, better support and upkeep during project and into maintenance mode. And finally, by having multiple people, the ability to anticipate and manage cost, timeline, and prioritize actions. We were about to do a facility for one client that was about to rip out 80% of the systems. So we quickly diverted to a different plant and installed it once on the newer system 6 months later, as opposed to doing it and then having to redo all of our work. On the maintenance side, you get a significant increase in accuracy. I've already said multiple times, the critical risk on high impact assets, being that cyber sniper, is absolutely valuable. And a significant decrease in effort, as I think we illustrated by the case study a moment ago. This is, I can't say enough about this multitude or this exponential change in insight and ability to act, and how that impacts your overall security and your management of security and risk without having to bring an army. It's a really, really compelling story. So summary, risk is on the rise. I mean, I didn't really dig into that too much because I know that this audience is here because of that first point. Risk is on the rise. I don't sell on FUD. I've not once said any of the big headline grabbing events or incidents that I'm sure you're all aware of. Whether we do it because we're scared or whether we do it because it's the right thing to do, we all know that it's not going to go away and we need to do something. And there is an increase in technical debt, as well as growth and exploits as we continue down our current path. If we keep doing the same thing and expect different results, we're going to be disappointed. Programmatic plan is required. We can't scattershot at this. We can't try to do certain things in little bits and pieces here and there. We need to actually have a sustainable, manageable program that's proactive. All roads, in my opinion, lead to comprehensive real-time inventory and status via a multifunction platform. It's the only way to fight this battle in OT. And the mouse and the cookie is how we all got here, right? That plus a few legacy challenges like disparate tools, silos of responsibility, and not knowing what the end game was going to be. And so I strongly compel you to look at security in a different way in the OT space. Throw out what you know, throw out what you're afraid of. Don't be so afraid of obstacles. You'd be surprised at how many of the OEMs and plant floor people are saying, look, I'm tired of being behind, a dollar short, a day late, having an assessor come in and say, I don't change passwords, I don't patch, give me a solution. This solution, this path out of the woods and the challenge into something more sustainable and tangible is very, very compelling, and you might be surprised at what sort of support you get. That's the end of my planned session, and I notice we do at least have one question in the Q&A. There is a Q&A portion here if anybody would like to jump in. I'll take the one that's live, and then I've got a few that you had added prior to. We appreciate everybody reaching out when you registered. And if I don't get to your question in the next 10 minutes here, more than happy to send a written response to everybody's questions that you did. So I will get to them, if not live at the moment. I certainly will in the next few days. And I see a couple of people raise their hands. We're not going to do questions live via audio at the moment. If you could please maybe just chat your question in the Q&A, and I'll take those ones first. The first question was from Matthias Kratz. How would you treat one of the most typical access vectors of malware into OT environments, remote access from internal or external for maintenance purposes? Is that in some way handled or integrated by the platform? In a number of fashions, yes. There's a couple things that we currently do. One of the things when I talk about a multifunction platform, we have a very specific dashboard that looks at all systems that are designated as jump boxes and how are they configured. Do they have least privileges? 46 recommended controls on systems like removing the guest account, renaming the admin account, keeping up to date with patches, enumerating the users on it, logging when the users come in, logging when they fail logins, or if they have multiple fails followed by success. We have host-based intrusion detection and system health capabilities that also would add to profiling those very specific subset of assets. And one of the cool things that we're developing right now in response to one of those events is building what are called canaries. And canaries are a technical term for specific files and functions that you monitor that would be indicators of a malware compromise. We're adding those to our monitoring capability. So Matthias, for your question, I'm not an identity or access management where I make an individual account with, encrypted passwords, et cetera, like a CyberArk or something or multi-factor, but everything else around that jump point, who's on it, how they're configured. We have a client, for example, that enumerated all their jump boxes, and they found that a great number of the passwords, the group policy inheritance on that level, were telling them to change their password, but the flag wasn't set to use a unique password. So they were quote unquote changing their password for the last 3 years, but they were using the same password for those 3 years. So yes, the multifunction platform would allow you to bring in multiple indicators on those jump boxes of who's in there, when they're in there, how the box is designed, how it's configured, what's happening to it. So everything from static data to transactional data relative to that asset. I hope that answers your question, Matthias. If not, please feel free to jump back in the Q&A and clarify that you need additional context on that one. So second question here in the chat, Mohammed, thank you. You're the one who had your hand up and you typed it. What type of tool do you recommend for OT penetration tests from business network to OT? That's outside of my realm of expertise. We have pen testers on our team. You can use any set of tools you want. In fact, the pure penetration testers, when they go to get their certification, they're not allowed to use tools. They have to actually identify through packet captures like Wireshark to see what might be open, do some research to know what might be exploitable, and build their own tools. So it's not so much the tool I think you need, Mohammed, as it is the pedigree of the person or the team doing the work. I also would suggest that a pen test, unless you're fairly mature or it's a regulatory need, again, depending on where you are in the process, might not be the best spend at first. You're probably going to find stuff that you expect to see, I guess is my point. Penetration tests are usually more to test your homework once you've done all the work. And I used to tell a story about a client that did this, where they did an assessment. They took all the assessments from the consultants. They did all the work, and then they told the consultant, we did everything you told us to do, come back and test us again. And all they did was drop a few USB keys randomly in the waiting room in the lobby, and sure enough, they got plugged in, they had the keys to kingdom again. And so it's that testing once you sort of have something that's more valuable. Now, again, not sure what your context is, But the actual question of what tool for penetration testing, it's more about the people doing the penetration tests and their capability than it is the tool itself. And if you wanted, I could introduce you to a few of my former pen testing friends that went through that security certification, and they can tell you how they're able to build exploits and understand things with freely available tools like Wireshark and then other exploit kits if you need it. And again, Mohammed, if you had more context, feel free to go back into the Q&A. I have time for a couple more questions, Leslie, unless you had something else on the side that I wasn't aware of just yet. Okay, I will get to some of the questions that were sent in. There's about 15 here that I can't necessarily get to all of them, but I'd like to capture a few of them that are very timely and pertinent to the topic. One of the questions is, what is the role of SIM as a single pane of security glass for ICS? I think the SIM is a starting point, and it would be, in my opinion, one of the data sources that we pull into the rest of the view that we've talked about today. In other words, it's great to see alerts, but if I don't know what's happening on that asset or the context of that asset or what other protections I might have, the SIM is just one data source relative to that whole environment. So we actually have both SIM and machine learning built into our dashboard so that when I'm looking at a Verve dashboard, I can see a SIM alert, but then I can see a SIM alert or a machine learning alert relative to an asset, and then pivot into everything else I know about that asset. That's really the only way for you to have context to be able to act or not, to see if that's something you need to worry about. So when you ask about the role of the SIM, I think it's an absolutely fundamental requirement that you need to pull data in. In fact, many clients that have an SOC, we're doing all that pre-processing at the OT layer, and we're sending an alert up to the SOC and saying, look, here's the OT specific data on a particular event that's emerging, and then giving them access back to all the other data we have. So a SIM is an integral part, but it's just one piece of data relative to everything else we need to know. One of the other questions, does the Verve solution support IT-OT convergence? I think it absolutely does in that think global, act local. Again, we have clients today where a single group of practitioners, primarily OT, I think 6 out of 8 are OT, the other 2 are IT liaisons to the security office, to the vulnerability office. Something comes out, they're able to see any number of 6,000 Windows assets in 57 countries around the world. And OT can say immediately, okay, here's our list of where that risk applies. IT helped me understand how I would do compensating controls because I can only patch about half of them. And so that sort of organization and that structure, and both think global, act local, as well as the data we have being pulled up, absolutely drives highly effective and efficient collaboration between IT and OT. Couple other ones here. OT cost fortunes, United Security Platform. Yeah, so system admin mistakes in IT could be acceptable and quickly recovered, but in OT it could cause fortunes. I think we mean problems in a unified security platform. You're absolutely right. That's why I told the story of, when it's important, the way that we approach actions in the OT space is we have very granular control about what does or doesn't happen and what's automated. So in the example of the removal of a particular type of software, the central team was able to identify 146 copies of it at 6 different generation facilities. And they were able to preload all of the actions, i.e. Get ready to uninstall it, load it locally, that action to this device. But they set a flag, said make it an offer. And what that meant was nothing happened until an OT practitioner was at that system and said, yes, this system can do this or not. So you're absolutely right that a system admin in IT can make a big mistake. We have a client that an IT admin rebooted a firewall that took a lot of pipelines down. This prevents that. In fact, it automates as much as is humanly possible outside of expecting the OT team on the plant floor to know this stuff, to manually do it and run it down. It hands it to them on a platter and says, here, we've done everything up to actually touching the system. It's your system. Here's all that you need to know. You do it or not. And that's where you build that OT safeguarded. I think I have time for one more. I'm trying to see which one makes the most sense, because like I said, there's a bunch of them in here. One of them is more of a product question. I don't really want to jump into that one. Are there any best frameworks to be applied per verticals? So a regulatory type of question. Are there any best framework and solutions that could be applied per verticals, i.e. specific to an industry? Yes, there are emerging industry standards, whether it's by a government in a region saying all critical infrastructure, like in the UK, and then NIST standards shall apply to everything that is operating in critical infrastructure. You can look at very specific standards. Primarily, I've seen more in North America than others at the moment, i.e. there's an emerging one for water. There's, of course, one for power. The best framework and solution really is the one that fits your organization. So the NIST CSF actually maps to multiple of those standards. So if you didn't want to have to research all of them, you could go to the NIST and see sort of a mapping, so that Section 1 maps to NERC CIP 2 versus CSC 20 number 1, COBIT 853, et cetera. So the NIST CSF is a good one. One of the fastest emerging standards is the CSC 20. You can get that from cisecurity.org. It's a more universal standard. It has a lot of IT stuff in it, like how do you secure your mail server, which you just discard or ignore for OT. But there are multiple standards, and many of them have very significant overlap. Some are very, very aggressive. There's one I saw in the UK that I think took everything that everyone's ever written and put it all into one. So it's got lots on management and tracking and verification of process, as opposed to just saying, I've got a security process. Do I have a process? Yes. Have I tested it? Yes. Can I verify it? Yes. As an independent person, checked it and made sure that what I'm saying is right. Like, it's very, very robust, maybe more so than you need. But to answer the question, if there are industry verticals, there are geographic standards that are emerging, but there's no shortage when you look at things like NIST or CSC 20, or even the ISA 99, which is now the IEC 62443. It's not as prescriptive. CSC 20 I like, because when you say I want a maturity level 2 in inventory, it says I shall have an inventory of all my assets, and maturity level 2 says there's some level of automation or verification to it. So it gives you what you're trying to achieve, where some of them are more, thou shalt have an inventory. Last question. Who should lead the OT security project, IT or factory operations? That is an excellent question, and it is should be both. Now, when you say lead the OT security program, I would suspect that, in my opinion, IT brings what the best practice is. This is what we shall do. This is what it should look like. This is the level of scrutiny we want. And then OT comes and says, I can get this close to that standard. Now, I always tell the IT team, I will help the OT guys get there, but we may need a different set of tools and a different path to get there. So when it comes to what it needs to do, it probably should come from the security expert, i.e. the IT team usually. But when it comes to how do we do that and can we do that, that has to come from the OT team. And I don't mean to deflect on that question, Hossein, I like the question, but there's no one answer. I can't just have IT come and force stuff on OT, and I can't have OT be expected to know all the nuances of an IT security program, or for an organization to invest in two shadow departments. Now, it is the single most contested topic in OT right now, IT or OT, and what they call convergence. And really, at the end of the day, it has to fit your organization. If you're trying to do something that just doesn't fit organizationally, it'll be a challenge. We're talking to companies where OT has been trying for a year or two, they're just too busy, and suddenly the CISO told IT they now need to go do something. And so IT is trying to force their way in, and that doesn't necessarily have great results either. So I hope that answers your question, Hossein. What we should do probably comes from IT, but how we do it absolutely has to be colored and flavored and influenced by OT. Anyways, that's it for today. Thank you everybody for your time. We're at the top of the hour. This will be recorded and posted online, and the rest of the questions I didn't get to, my team here has gathered who they came from and what's up there. So happy to try and get written responses back to those. And we really appreciate you coming. My contact information is up there on the website. If anybody wants to know more, please feel free to reach out. Once again, thank you for your time today. I hope it was worth your while, and have a great day.